The rain hammered the tin roofs with relentless force, turning the market into a storm of noise and motion. In the center of it all, Elias stood barefoot, his toes sinking into cold mud. The burlap sack in his hands was worn thin, frayed threads clinging to its edges. A merchant snarled, "Move, boy," as he pushed past, nearly knocking him over. Elias steadied himself, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to flinch. People rushed by, their umbrellas shielding them from the storm, yet none shielded him from their indifference. The air smelled of wet earth and roasted chestnuts, but hunger muted every scent. He didn't cry, not anymore. Tears had no value here. Instead, he held his breath, feeling the weight of every raindrop, as if it were a reminder. Life would not hand him kindness. The cold bit deep, but inside, something burned hotter than the rain was cold. It was not hope. It was defiance. The market's chaos swelled, but Elias's gaze was fixed on a small coffee stall tucked between two fabric vendors. The air there was different. Warm, rich, alive with the scent of roasted beans. He edged closer, his feet sinking deeper into the mud. The vendor, a wiry man with quick hands, poured dark liquid into tiny paper cups. Steam curled upward like whispers in the cold air. Elias could almost taste it, though he had never owned a coin to buy it. He watched customers laugh, their hands warmed by what he could only dream of. His stomach clenched, not with hunger for food, but for belonging. Coffee wasn't survival. It was dignity, served hot. He stood there longer than he should have, letting the scent brand itself into his mind. It was a promise he made silently. One day he would have not just a cup, but a place where no one was turned away. The stall owner noticed the boy staring and frowned. "No coins, no coffee," he said without malice but without warmth. Elias didn't reply. He just nodded and stepped back, but his eyes stayed fixed on the steam. The smell clung to him as the rain washed over his shoulders. Behind him, someone shouted prices for oranges, another for fish, but those sounds faded. All he heard was the hiss of the kettle, the gentle pour into cups, the clink of coins. The vendor's hands moved with precision, and Elias memorized every motion. Even as his stomach growled, he thought not of drinking the coffee, but of making it. There was power in the way people leaned forward to take their cups, in the way warmth brought strangers together. He wanted that power, even if he didn't yet know what it would cost. Elias turned to leave, the cold reclaiming him as he stepped away from the stall. His feet splashed through shallow puddles, each ripple distorting the reflection of the lights behind him. He passed a stack of wooden crates, their edges slick with rain, and pulled his burlap sack tighter. In its depths were a few scraps of bread, hard enough to cut his gums, but enough to keep him standing. He glanced back once, just once, to see another customer laughing, steam rising between them and the vendor like a shared secret. His chest tightened. That coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a barrier, one he couldn't yet cross. But in that moment he knew he wouldn't remain outside forever. The rain didn't feel as heavy anymore. Somewhere inside, a seed had been planted, and it would grow in the most unexpected soil. The storm deepened as Elias reached the edge of the market, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt paths. The wind caught his sack, flapping it against his side. He stopped beneath a sagging awning, its fabric torn, offering little shelter. The smell of coffee still lingered, and he closed his eyes, committing it to memory. Lightning cracked in the distance, briefly illuminating his face. For a moment, the world seemed frozen, the rain hanging in the air like glass beads. He opened his eyes and stepped back into the downpour, each step a quiet vow. Life had taken much from him, shoes, warmth, family, but it had not taken his will. And as long as that remained, he knew he could build something. One day he would make the world come to him, and they would drink his coffee. The next morning brought no sun, only a damp chill clinging to the air. Elias walked the dirt path toward the city's inner streets, the burlap sack slung over his shoulder. The markets here were louder, richer, filled with scents that mocked his hunger. A group of boys leaned against a cart, their shoes polished, their laughter sharp as glass. One called out, "Barefoot again, rat?" Another tossed a pebble that struck his shin. Elias kept walking, his jaw tightening. He could taste the copper tang of humiliation, but he did not look back. The laughter swelled as he turned the corner, vanishing into the shadowed lanes. There, away from their voices, he let out a slow breath. The city was not made for boys like him, but he would carve a place into it all the same, even if it meant starting with nothing but his bare feet and a will forged in storms. The lanes twisted into the heart of the city, where stone buildings towered close enough to block the sky. Elias slowed near a bakery window, the golden crusts glowing in the lamplight. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, thin and rain-damp. Inside, a man placed steaming loaves on wooden racks, the scent drifting into the street like a cruel invitation. Elias's stomach growled, but he turned away. Hunger was familiar, almost comfortable now. He saved his energy for something greater than bread. As he walked, his eyes caught on a stack of discarded crates behind a shop. He paused, considering them. Wood meant structure, and structure meant possibility. For the first time that day, a small idea began to take root, faint but alive. By midday, the rain had eased, leaving puddles that mirrored the jagged rooftops. Elias sat behind the stack of crates, his hands tracing the worn wood. He could hear the market nearby, voices bargaining, wheels creaking over cobblestones. He closed his eyes and pictured the coffee stall, its steam curling upward, its warmth pulling people closer. The idea sharpened. He didn't need to own a stall yet. He needed to learn. He would start by watching, by understanding every movement of those who worked. From how they held the cup to how they smiled at customers, it was all part of the craft. The thought steadied him. Even without a coin in his pocket, he felt richer than he had in years, because now he had direction. That evening, Elias found himself near the coffee stall again, the crowd thick with workers ending their day. The vendor moved quickly, each pour a performance. Elias stayed just far enough to be unseen, but close enough to study every detail. He watched how the man balanced speed with care, never spilling, never wasting a drop. Customers left smiling, holding their cups as if they carried treasure. Elias's fingers itched to try, but he remained still. The wind carried the scent to him, rich and intoxicating. It didn't make him feel hungrier, it made him feel sharper, like every sense was honing in on the future he imagined. As night fell, the market thinned, lanterns swaying in the cool breeze. The vendor closed his stall, packing supplies into crates. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady despite the racing in his chest. "I'd help you clean," he said. The man eyed him, then shook his head. No coins, no work. The rejection stung, but Elias didn't move away. "I can work for nothing," he added. The man hesitated, then turned back to his packing without a word. Elias stood there in the dim light, the damp earth cold under his feet. He had been turned away, but he would return. He would keep returning until the man had no choice but to see him, not as a boy with no shoes, but as someone who belonged behind that counter. Days turned into weeks, and Elias returned to the stall each evening. The vendor never invited him in, but neither did he chase him away. Elias learned to anticipate the man's needs, handing over an empty cup before it was called for, wiping the counter when spills occurred. One evening, a customer dropped a coin, and Elias caught it mid-fall, returning it without a word. The vendor gave him the faintest nod. It was the first acknowledgement that Elias existed beyond the crowd. That small gesture felt heavier than gold. The nights were still cold, the rain still bit into his skin, but he was no longer invisible. He began to understand that trust was not given, it was earned, one unnoticed act at a time. One night, as the vendor stepped away to fetch supplies, a man in a fine coat approached the stall. He eyed Elias and said, "Pour me one, boy." Elias hesitated, his hands hovering over the kettle. He had watched the process 100 times, measure, pour, serve. His fingers moved before doubt could stop them. Steam rose as the liquid filled the cup, and the man smiled faintly, placing a coin on the counter. When the vendor returned, the coin still sat there. His eyes moved from the cup in the man's hand to Elias's steady gaze. There was no anger, only calculation. Elias realized he had just crossed a line. The vendor said nothing until the last customer left. Then in a low voice he asked, "You want to work here?" Elias met his eyes and nodded. "Then be here at dawn," the man replied. The words struck like a bell, sharp and echoing in Elias's chest. For the first time he would see the market before it woke, feel the stall come alive from its first breath of steam. As he walked away that night, the cobblestones glistened under lantern light, and every reflection seemed to shimmer with possibility. Sleep would be impossible. He had been waiting too long for this. Dawn was still a whisper when Elias arrived. The air was sharp, his breath clouding in front of him. The vendor was already there, unlocking the stall. "Water first," he instructed, handing Elias a bucket. The boy ran to the well, the icy weight cutting into his palms. They worked in silence, the rhythm of preparation settling into place, grinding beans, arranging cups, lighting the small stove. The first hiss of boiling water felt like a signal to the city itself. For Elias, it was more than work. It was entry into a world he had only watched from the outside. By the time the first customers arrived, Elias's hands moved with practiced care. He poured water, measured coffee, and passed cups without spilling a drop. The vendor watched closely, saying little, but his lack of correction was its own form of praise. A woman smiled at Elias as she took her drink, and he felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the steam. For the first time in his life he was not just surviving, he was part of something. Yet in the shadows beyond the stall, a figure lingered, unseen by Elias, watching his every move with quiet intent. The shadow that had lingered beyond the stall finally stepped forward. A tall man in a dark coat placed his hands on the counter, his eyes never leaving Elias. "You work here now?" he asked softly. The vendor froze mid-motion, glancing between them. Elias nodded cautiously. The man's lips curled into something between a smile and a smirk. "Then you work for me too," he said. Elias didn't understand. The man pulled a folded paper from his coat, its seal marked with a crest. The vendor's face paled. Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the paper behind. Elias stared at it, sensing a door had just opened, or a trap had just been sprung. When the crowd thinned, the vendor unrolled the paper. His hands shook slightly. "This man owns half this market," he said, "including this stall." Elias blinked, trying to process the words. The vendor's tone carried a weight that made the boy's stomach twist. "If he wants you, it's because he sees something he can use." The words felt like both warning and compliment. Elias looked at the crest again, its lines sharp, deliberate, powerful. He didn't know whether to be afraid or eager. Opportunity and danger had arrived together, and he couldn't tell which one would win. The next day, Elias found the man waiting at the edge of the market. "Walk with me," he said. His stride was long, his coat brushing against his legs as they moved through narrow lanes. He spoke little, asking only about how Elias had learned so quickly at the stall. "I watch," Elias replied simply. The man's eyes narrowed in thought. "Watching is good, but acting is better." They stopped before a shuttered shop with a faded sign. "This could be yours," the man said. Elias's chest tightened. The door was locked, dust layering the windows, but he could almost see it alive with warmth and light. Inside the shop, dust motes swirled in shafts of pale light. The man's voice was calm but deliberate. "I'll give you the space, the tools, even the beans. In return, you'll sell for me." Elias ran his fingers over the rough counter, the scent of old wood mixing with the faint ghost of coffee from years past. The offer sounded like a dream, but dreams often came with prices hidden deep in the fine print. He met the man's gaze. "Why me?" The man's smirk returned. "Because you have nothing to lose, and that makes you dangerous." That night, Elias lay awake under the awning at the market's edge, staring at the dark outline of the stall in the distance. The man's words echoed in his mind. A chance to have his own place was beyond anything he had imagined. But working for someone who owned half the market meant debts that could bind tighter than chains. Rain began to fall again, pattering softly on the canvas above. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. The city was offering him a hand, but was it to lift him up or pull him under? At dawn, Elias stood before the shuttered shop the man had shown him. The key was cold in his hand, heavier than it should have been. He hesitated, knowing that turning it would change everything. Around him, the market was just waking. Vendors rolling carts into place, voices low and distant. He slid the key into the lock and turned it. The creak of the door echoed like a bell. Inside, the air was still thick with dust, but in his mind, he could already see steam rising, cups clinking, people gathering. This was his moment, yet his chest felt tight. He wasn't just opening a shop. He was opening himself to the man who had given him the key, and whatever price would come with it. By midday, the shop was unrecognizable. Elias had scrubbed the counters, washed the windows, and stacked the cups in neat rows. The vendor from his old stall stopped at the doorway, arms crossed. "You think this man is doing you a favor?" he asked. Elias didn't answer. Favors from men like him are debts you can't repay. The words stung because they rang true. Still, Elias turned back to polishing the counter. The vendor sighed, stepping away. Elias knew he had not earned the older man's blessing, but he couldn't let someone else's fear dictate his future. The first customer came in that afternoon, a young woman with tired eyes and a hesitant smile. Elias served her carefully, every movement measured. She sipped, and for a brief moment, her shoulders relaxed. Word spread quickly, and soon the shop filled. The air grew warm, alive with voices and the smell of roasted beans. Elias worked without pause, the rhythm of grinding, pouring, and serving carrying him forward. He felt powerful in a way he had never known. Outside, though, the man in the dark coat watched through the window, his expression unreadable. That night, as Elias counted the day's coins, the man entered without knocking. "A good start," he said, his voice smooth. He placed a ledger on the counter. "Your earnings go here. Half to me, half to you." Elias's fingers froze on the coins. Half. It was more than he'd ever had, yet the number still cut deep. The man leaned closer. "Remember, without me, you have nothing." Elias met his gaze, the first spark of defiance flickering. "Without me, you have no shop." The man's smile faded, but only slightly. It was the first real challenge between them. The market slept, but Elias stayed awake, leaning against the shop's doorway. The coins were locked away, the counter clean, the air still faintly scented with coffee. Above, the stars were hidden behind clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at another storm. He thought of the vendor's warning, of the man's terms, of the customer's smiles. He didn't know if he had made the right choice. But he knew one thing. He would fight to keep what he had built, no matter who tried to take it. And in that silent vow, the boy with no shoes became something far more dangerous. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm Elias had never known. Customers queued before sunrise, their chatter like the hum of a waking city. The smell of coffee drifted beyond the doorway, pulling strangers inside. Yet the man in the dark coat began arriving earlier each day, lingering in the corner. He pretended to read ledgers, but his eyes followed every pour, every exchange. Elias smiled for the customers, his hands moving with practiced grace, but inside he felt the walls closing in. Prosperity filled his till, but freedom seemed to shrink with every coin. Success was supposed to feel light. This felt like a weight pressing deeper into his chest. One afternoon, the vendor from Elias's first stall stepped into the doorway. His eyes scanned the neatly arranged shelves before settling on Elias. "You've built something fine," he said, his voice low, tinged with concern. He leaned in slightly. "But he's not letting you grow. It's so you never outgrow him." Elias froze, the cup in his hand catching the light. The truth struck like a sudden gust of cold wind. The vendor gave a single nod, turned, and walked back into the market without waiting for a reply. The noise of the shop returned slowly, but Elias felt suspended, the warning replaying louder than the clink of cups around him. That night, after the last cup was washed, Elias remained behind the counter, wiping the same spot as if trying to polish away his unease. The man in the dark coat appeared without a sound, placing a sealed envelope on the counter. The red wax glinted under the lamplight. "You'll open a second stall," he said. Elias's pulse quickened. Expansion meant more customers, more reach. But before the thought could settle, the man added, "And you'll run it exactly how I say." The air felt heavier. The envelope wasn't an offer. It was a leash. Elias's hand hovered over it, but he didn't touch it. The next day, Elias visited the second location. The man walked beside him, speaking of profits and prestige, his voice echoing in the empty space. Sunlight poured through wide windows, making the polished floor gleam. It was larger, cleaner, in a better part of the market. And yet, to Elias, it felt wrong. The openness looked like walls, the light like a spotlight. Every detail spoke of a place owned in name, but not in spirit. He kept his expression neutral, but inside the truth grew sharper. This wasn't freedom. It was a golden cage, and the door was already closing. That night, Elias returned to his first shop. The air was rich with the familiar scent of roasted beans, the counters clean, the till locked. Outside, the market dimmed into shadow, rain beginning to fall in fine threads. He stood in the doorway, thinking of the boy who once stood barefoot in the storm, unseen. He had climbed high, but every rung had been placed by someone else. Now the path split, comfort within another man's grip or risk in walking alone. The rain thickened, soaking his shirt, but he didn't move. He had made his choice, even if he hadn't spoken it yet. It would come soon, and it would change everything. Elias walked into the man's office at dawn, bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. The air smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old paper. The man glanced up, his eyes sharp even in the low light. "You're early," he said. Elias stepped closer. "I'm not taking the second shop," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. The man's brow furrowed, his fingers pausing on the pen in his hand. Silence filled the room like smoke. Then, slowly, he leaned back. "You understand that means you're finished here?" Elias nodded once. "Then I'll be finished, but on my terms." He turned, feeling the tension in the room follow him like a shadow. Each step toward the door felt like breaking through chains. Power, he realized, wasn't about owning a stall or coins, it was about walking away from the wrong deal. Back at his shop, Elias moved slowly, gathering only what mattered. He left the ledger untouched, left the coins in the till. The burlap sack, frayed but strong, was the first thing he folded. Customers stepped in, their smiles fading as they saw him packing. A woman asked softly, "Why leave when it's yours?" Elias shook his head with a faint smile. "Because it isn't mine if I can't decide how to run it." She nodded, understanding. Some customers offered to help him carry his things, but he refused gently. Every item that stayed behind felt like a weight he had lifted from his shoulders. He was leaving with almost nothing, but it was nothing he owned completely. Elias stepped into the market with the burlap sack slung over his shoulder. The air was fresh after last night's rain, the cobblestones glistening like black glass. Stalls shouted prices, vendors called greetings, but his walk was unhurried. The old vendor from his first days spotted him and gave a single slow nod, a gesture heavy with respect. Elias returned it without breaking stride. He passed the coffee stall where it all began, its steam curling into the air, and felt no bitterness, only gratitude. Every step took him further from the man's shadow and closer to the edge of the market, where the noise thinned and the air felt open. He was not looking for permission anymore. He was looking for space. At the farthest edge of the market, Elias found it, a sunlit corner where the first rays of morning stretched long across the stones. The space was bare, just an open patch, framed by an old brick wall on one side, and the slow current of the street on the other. He stood in the center, eyes scanning the angles of light, the flow of people passing nearby. He could already picture salvaged wooden beams forming a counter, the hiss of a kettle, the scent of fresh ground beans cutting through the morning air. No one owned this space, no rent collectors, no ledgers with someone else's name. It was his in the only way that mattered, because he chose it. That night, Elias lay on his burlap sack under the open sky, the market's hum reduced to a distant murmur. No roof above him, no walls, just the cold air and the scatter of stars. He thought of the boy who once stood in the rain, invisible, ignored. That boy had begged for a place in someone else's world. This man would build his own. He whispered into the darkness, "One day, they'll drink my coffee in every street of this city." The breeze shifted, carrying the faint aroma of roasted beans from the market, and he smiled. The boy with no shoes was gone. In his place lay a man who would not be bought, and whose empire would start with nothing more than an empty corner and a stubborn heart.